That line got men killed. The room fell silent. More than 200 guests stood inside the National Military History Museum as cameras rolled and historians celebrated the unveiling of the most accurate battle display ever built. Then an 86-year-old veteran in a faded gray jacket pointed at the giant map and calmly said it was wrong. Dr. Evan Caldwell, the award-winning historian leading the project, forced a smile. "Sir, this reconstruction was verified by military archives, university researchers, and battlefield records." A few people chuckled. The old man didn't. He kept staring at a tiny flag planted on a ridge line. "Company B was never there," he said. "They were trapped in the wash below." Caldwell folded his arms. "That's impossible." The veteran slowly shook his head. "No. What's impossible is that nobody caught it." Now people were listening. Caldwell stepped closer. "And how would you know that?" The old man's eyes never left the map. "Because I carried the message that night." The crowd went quiet. A young museum assistant named Emily Carter froze when she heard him say those words. Then the veteran pointed to a narrow trail missing from the display. "You left out Miller's Cut." Several historians exchanged confused looks. None of them had ever heard that name. But an elderly retired colonel near the back suddenly looked up. "What did you just call it?" The veteran answered softly. "Miller's Cut. That's where the survivors moved after the mortar strike." Emily's heart started racing. That name didn't exist in any public record. Caldwell laughed nervously. "There's no evidence of that." The veteran finally looked at him. "Then your evidence copied the wrong map." Hours later, long after visitors left, lights were still burning inside the archive wing. Historians pulled classified reports. Old battlefield photographs were scanned. Radio logs were compared line by line. And at 3:17 a.m., Emily found something nobody expected. Hidden beneath a burned corner of an original field map was a handwritten marking. 2 words, "Miller's Cut." By sunrise, the museum had closed the entire exhibit. Caldwell hadn't slept. Neither had anyone else. And when Colonel Richard Hayes arrived carrying a sealed military file, he walked straight past every historian in the room and stopped in front of the old veteran. Then he raised his hand in salute. "Mr. Whitaker," he said quietly, "there's something in this file nobody has seen for 70 years. That line got men killed." The words were quiet, almost swallowed by the hum of conversations, the soft clicking of cameras, and the polished confidence filling the grand hall of the National Military History Museum. Yet somehow, every voice seemed to stop at once. More than 200 guests stood beneath towering banners and carefully restored battle flags as the museum unveiled what experts were calling the most accurate reconstruction of the Battle of Red Hollow ever assembled. Historians, retired officers, journalists, and donors filled the room. At the center of it all stood Dr. Evan Caldwell, 34 years old, best-selling author, rising academic star, and the man responsible for the exhibit everyone had come to see. His presentation had been flawless. The lighting was perfect. The applause had been enthusiastic. Then an old man near the back of the crowd pointed toward the display and calmly suggested that one of the most studied battles in modern military history had been reconstructed incorrectly. Heads turned immediately. The old man didn't look important. His gray jacket was faded from years of wear. His white hair was thin. His posture carried the weight of age rather than authority. A worn veteran's cap rested beneath his arm. There were no medals on his chest. No entourage around him. No indication that anyone in the room should pay attention to him. Yet something about the way he stood felt different. Unmoving. Certain. Like a man looking at a memory instead of a museum exhibit. Caldwell offered a polite smile, the kind reserved for difficult interruptions. "Sir," he said, keeping his voice professional, "the display is based on verified records from military archives and historical sources." A few people nodded. Several guests exchanged amused looks. One reporter lowered her camera, expecting the moment to end. It didn't. The old man continued studying the map. His pale blue eyes focused on a tiny flag positioned on a ridge near the center of the battlefield model. "Company B wasn't there," he said. The room grew quieter. Caldwell's smile tightened slightly. "Excuse me. Company B wasn't on that ridge." The old man's voice remained calm. "They were trapped in the wash below it." A few historians nearby frowned. Caldwell folded his arms. "With respect, sir, every official report places them exactly where the display shows." The old man finally looked up. His eyes were steady, not angry, not defensive, just certain. Then the reports copied the wrong map. A nervous laugh escaped somewhere in the crowd. Caldwell took a step closer. And how would you know that? For the first time, the old man hesitated. Not because he doubted himself, because he seemed to be looking through the years, through the polished glass cases, through the carefully arranged artifacts, back toward something only he could see. Then he answered, because I carried the message that night. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. No one laughed this time. Across the room, a young museum assistant named Emily Carter felt a chill run down her spine. Because something in the old man's voice told her he wasn't guessing. He wasn't remembering a story. He was remembering a place. And before the day was over, the entire museum would discover just how much history they had gotten wrong. The silence lingered long after Thomas Whitaker spoke. It spread through the museum hall like a slow-moving tide, washing away the confidence that had filled the room only moments earlier. Dr. Evan Caldwell maintained his professional expression, but something behind his eyes had changed. The certainty was still there. The authority was still there. Yet now there was something else. Irritation. The kind that appears when a carefully planned presentation begins slipping beyond control. Sir, Caldwell said, choosing his words carefully, the Battle of Red Hollow has been studied for decades. Thousands of documents have been reviewed. Hundreds of experts have examined every detail. Thomas nodded once. I know. Then you understand why extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The old veteran looked back at the battlefield display. The miniature terrain stretched nearly 20 feet across the room. Tiny vehicles, tiny roads, tiny flags. Everything arranged with mathematical precision. Visitors admired it as history. Thomas stared at it like a memory that had been misplaced. Evidence is important, he said quietly. But sometimes the people reading the documents were not there when the documents were written. Several guests exchanged confused glances. Caldwell exhaled through his nose. Are you suggesting every historian got it wrong? No, Thomas paused. Just the first one. A few nervous laughs drifted through the crowd. Caldwell did not laugh. Emily Carter stood near the edge of the display, pretending to organize brochures. In reality, she had stopped paying attention to her work several minutes ago. Something about Thomas bothered her. Not because he seemed confused, because he seemed too certain. People who guessed usually looked uncertain. Thomas never once looked uncertain. He looked disappointed, as if he had spent years hoping someone would eventually notice the mistake on their own. Caldwell pointed toward the ridge on the model. The official field report clearly places Company B here. Thomas slowly raised a weathered hand and pointed several inches lower on the terrain map. No, they were down there. And you remember that after all these years? Caldwell asked. I remember because I walked it. The answer came instantly. No hesitation. No searching for details. Emily felt another chill. Thomas stepped closer to the display. The overhead lights reflected softly against the glass covering the battlefield model. There used to be a narrow trail along that creek bed, he said. Most people never noticed it. Caldwell folded his arms. There is no trail marked in any surviving map. That is because it was never official. Thomas continued studying the terrain. The men called it Miller's Cut. This time the reaction was immediate. A retired colonel, standing near the back, straightened suddenly. His eyes narrowed. What did you call it? Thomas glanced toward him. Miller's Cut. The colonel stared at the old veteran for several seconds. Then he looked back toward the display. His expression had gone pale. Emily noticed it immediately. So did Caldwell. The historian frowned. Colonel, have you heard that name before? The retired officer hesitated. For the first time all afternoon, someone other than Thomas appeared genuinely unsettled. Only once, he said quietly. And I was never supposed to. The room seemed smaller after the colonel spoke. The noise of the museum faded into an uneasy silence broken only by the distant hum of the air conditioning system above the exhibit hall. Dr. Evan Caldwell stared at the retired officer. What do you mean you were never supposed to? The colonel shifted his weight slowly. He was a tall man with silver hair and the posture of someone who had spent decades in uniform. A few moments earlier, he had been just another distinguished guest. Now every eye in the room was fixed on him. I saw the name once, he said carefully. Many years ago. It appeared in a document that disappeared before sunrise. Several historians exchanged puzzled looks. Caldwell frowned. That makes no sense. Most old military records do not. the colonel replied. Thomas Whitaker remained silent. He seemed almost detached from the growing tension around him. His attention stayed fixed on the battlefield display beneath the glass. The tiny ridge, the narrow valley, the winding creek. Details nobody else in the room appeared to see the same way he did. Emily Carter stepped closer. Something about the veteran's expression fascinated her. He was not enjoying this. He was not trying to prove anyone wrong. If anything, he looked tired. Tired of carrying a memory that had been misplaced for 70 years. Caldwell recovered his composure. With respect, Colonel, historical reconstruction is based on evidence, not stories. I agree, the colonel answered. That is why this is bothering me. The historian turned back toward Thomas. Can you tell us exactly where this so-called trail was? Without hesitation, Thomas pointed toward a section of terrain near the creek bed. It started there. His finger moved across the model. Then it curved behind the trees and crossed the wash about 300 yards south of the ridge. Several guests leaned forward. Caldwell opened a digital tablet and compared the model with archived maps. His confidence remained visible, but small cracks had begun to form. Nothing Thomas said should have matched. Yet the terrain itself seemed to support the route he described. Emily noticed something else. Thomas was not studying the display before answering. He already knew every turn, every slope, every distance, as if he had walked the ground yesterday instead of 7 decades ago. How can you remember that so clearly? She asked quietly. For the first time, Thomas looked directly at her. His pale blue eyes softened. Because some places never leave you. The answer lingered in the air. Emily felt it more than she understood it. Caldwell tapped his tablet screen several times. Then he stopped. His expression changed. Just slightly. Barely noticeable. But enough. That is strange, he muttered. What? Emily asked. Caldwell zoomed into an old aerial photograph displayed on the screen. It was grainy and faded with age. Most people would have seen nothing unusual. Thomas looked once and nodded. There. Caldwell swallowed. Hidden beneath the shadows of a tree line was a faint mark stretching toward the creek. Not a road. Not an official trail. But something. Something that should not have existed according to every map used to build the exhibit. The historian stared at the image for several long seconds before slowly lifting his eyes toward Thomas Whitaker. For the first time that afternoon, he was no longer looking at an elderly visitor. He was looking at a witness. The atmosphere inside the museum had changed completely. The celebration was still happening around them, but it felt distant now, like a radio playing in another room. Guests who had arrived expecting speeches and photographs were quietly gathering closer to the battlefield display. Nobody wanted to leave. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. Dr. Evan Caldwell stared at the enlarged aerial image on his tablet. The faint line hidden beneath the shadows should not have been there. Every reconstruction team member had reviewed that photograph dozens of times. Some had spent months studying it. Yet somehow an 86-year-old veteran had noticed something they all missed within minutes of walking into the exhibit. Caldwell enlarged the image again. Then again. His jaw tightened. It could be erosion, he said, or an imaging artifact. The explanation sounded reasonable, even convincing, but not even he seemed convinced by it. Thomas Whitaker remained calm. No, Caldwell looked up. No, that trail was real. The old veteran's voice was steady. The ground was soft after the rain. You could barely see it unless the sunlight hit from the west. Several historians nearby exchanged surprised looks. One of them pulled out a notebook. Another began photographing the display from different angles. Emily Carter watched all of it unfold with growing fascination. She had worked at the museum for 4 years. She had seen experts debate maps, documents, and photographs before, but she had never seen one man challenge an entire historical narrative without raising his voice. Thomas never sounded defensive. He sounded like someone correcting a misspelled word. How many men knew about the trail? Emily asked. Thomas thought for a moment. Not many. His eyes drifted back toward the miniature terrain beneath the glass. Most officers did not use it. It was narrow, hidden, easy to miss. Then who named it? Emily asked. The question seemed to catch him off guard. For the first time, a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. Not pride, not amusement, something closer to memory. A kid from Ohio. The room grew quiet again. What was his name? Emily asked softly. Thomas looked at the display. For several seconds he did not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. Daniel Miller. The retired colonel closed his eyes. Caldwell looked confused. I have never seen that name in any operational report. You would not, Thomas replied. Most people would not. The answer lingered heavily in the air. Then something unexpected happened. The colonel reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and removed an old leather notebook. The cover was cracked with age. The pages had yellowed over decades. Slowly, carefully, he opened it. I wrote this during an archive review in 1987, he said. I was ordered to forget what I saw. Every person standing nearby leaned closer. The colonel turned several pages before stopping. His finger rested on a faded handwritten note. He swallowed once, then looked directly at Thomas Whitaker. The name was Daniel Miller. For the first time all afternoon, the old veteran lowered his eyes. And the room suddenly realized they were no longer discussing a map. They were uncovering a story that history had quietly left behind. For several moments, nobody spoke. The museum hall felt suspended in time. The old leather notebook remained open in the colonel's hands while dozens of eyes moved back and forth between the faded page and Thomas Whitaker. Outside the tall windows, the afternoon sun had begun to sink lower across the city skyline, casting long bands of gold across the polished floor. Inside, history itself seemed to be shifting. Dr. Evan Caldwell stepped closer to the notebook. May I see it? The colonel hesitated before carefully handing it over. Caldwell examined the aging paper. The handwriting was faded but still readable. There it was. Daniel Miller. The same name Thomas had spoken only moments earlier. The historian read the line twice. Then a third time. This cannot be a coincidence, one of the researchers whispered. Emily Carter watched Caldwell's expression change again. The confidence that had defined him all afternoon was beginning to give way to something else. Curiosity. Serious curiosity. The kind that drives historians into archives for months at a time. Who was Daniel Miller? Caldwell finally asked. Thomas remained quiet for a few seconds. His eyes rested on the battlefield display, on the tiny creek, on the narrow valley, on the forgotten path hidden between them. He was 19, Thomas said softly, from a farm outside Columbus, Ohio. The room grew still. Most people never heard of him. Thomas reached into the pocket of his old jacket. His movements were slow and deliberate. From deep inside, he removed a small object wrapped in a worn handkerchief. The fabric itself looked decades old. Carefully, he unfolded it. Resting in the center was a tarnished metal compass. It was scratched and weathered by time. Nothing about it appeared valuable. Yet Thomas looked at it the way people look at family photographs. Emily immediately noticed the change in his face. The distance in his eyes. The quiet weight of memory. That was his, Thomas said. Nobody interrupted. Nobody moved. Even the guests who had originally come for photographs and speeches seemed unable to look away. He carried it everywhere. Thomas gently turned the compass in his hand. The overhead lights reflected across its worn surface. The trail got its name because Daniel found it first. Caldwell leaned forward. The trail was named after him. Thomas nodded. Unofficially, a faint smile crossed his face. We were young. We named everything. Several people chuckled softly. The tension eased for only a moment before Thomas continued. The maps never showed it. The reports never mentioned it. But everybody who walked that ground knew it was there. Emily found herself staring at the old compass. Something about it felt important. Not because of what it was, because of what it represented. A memory carried across 70 years. A detail too small for official records. Too important to forget. Caldwell carefully closed the notebook. His eyes returned to Thomas. If the trail existed, he said slowly, then there may be other things the records missed. Thomas looked directly at him. There are. The answer landed heavily. Around them, museum staff had stopped working. Historians had stopped arguing. Even the guests had stopped whispering. And for the first time all day, Dr. Evan Caldwell realized the battlefield display was no longer the story. Thomas Whitaker was. The old compass rested quietly in Thomas Whitaker's palm. For a moment, nobody spoke. The museum hall, once filled with confident conversations and ceremonial speeches, now felt more like a library after midnight. Every person present seemed afraid to interrupt whatever invisible thread was being pulled from the past. Dr. Evan Caldwell looked from the compass to the battlefield display and back again. The exhibit he had spent 3 years building suddenly felt incomplete. Not wrong everywhere, just incomplete in ways he had never imagined. What else did the records miss? He asked. Thomas slowly closed his fingers around the compass. The question lingered between them. Outside, the fading sunlight cast long shadows across the floor. The glass cases reflected gold and amber light. Dust drifted through the air like tiny sparks suspended in time. Thomas looked toward the display. His eyes settled on a section of terrain near the creek. The records remember positions, he said quietly. They remember units. They remember dates. He paused. But they forget people. Emily Carter felt a knot tighten in her chest. The old veteran was no longer correcting history. He was explaining it. Daniel Miller was one of those people, she said softly. Thomas nodded. There were others. Caldwell glanced toward the researchers gathering around the exhibit. Several were already comparing maps and photographs. Others had open laptops. The atmosphere had changed from celebration to investigation. Why was the trail never documented? One historian asked. Thomas gave a faint smile. Because nobody thought it mattered. The answer landed heavily. Emily understood immediately. Historians often searched for major decisions, famous leaders, and official records. But countless smaller details disappeared over time. A trail, a nickname, a conversation, a memory, the things that never made it into reports. The retired colonel stepped closer. There was another note in that archive, he said quietly. Every head turned toward him. I only saw it for a few seconds. Thomas looked up. For the first time, genuine surprise crossed his face. What note? The colonel hesitated. A handwritten annotation on a field sketch. Caldwell immediately opened his tablet. What did it say? The colonel looked directly at Thomas. It mentioned a compass. The room froze. Thomas did not move. He did not blink. His hand tightened around the tarnished object. Emily felt her pulse quicken. Even Caldwell seemed stunned. That is impossible, the historian whispered. The colonel shook his head slowly. That is exactly what I thought in 1987. Thomas lowered his eyes to the compass. The metal reflected a thin ribbon of evening light. For decades it had been a private memory, a simple keepsake carried through an entire lifetime. Yet somehow its existence had appeared inside a forgotten military document, a document almost nobody had ever seen. Caldwell stared at the compass. What was written in the note? He asked. The colonel took a slow breath. Then he answered, Return the compass to Whitaker. He knows where the missing map is. The words seemed to pull the air out of the room. Return the compass to Whitaker. He knows where the missing map is. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the museum staff standing near the entrance had stopped what they were doing. The statement hung there, impossible to ignore and even harder to explain. Dr. Evan Caldwell looked from the colonel to Thomas Whitaker. Then back again. A missing map? He asked. The colonel nodded slowly. That was the exact wording. Caldwell shook his head. There has never been any record of a missing map associated with Red Hollow. Not in public archives, the colonel replied. The distinction was impossible to miss. Emily Carter felt her heart racing. The story had already become far larger than a disputed battlefield display. They were no longer discussing historical interpretation. They were standing on the edge of something hidden, something forgotten. Thomas remained silent. His weathered fingers rested against the old compass. The overhead lights reflected softly across the scratched metal surface. He looked less surprised than everyone else. In fact, he looked tired, as though a door he had spent decades keeping closed had finally been pushed open. Caldwell noticed it too. You know what they are talking about, do you not? The historian's voice was quieter now. Gone was the confidence of the public lecturer. Gone was the certainty of the expert correcting a visitor. He was asking a question. Thomas stared at the compass for several long seconds. Then he slowly nodded. A murmur swept through the crowd. Emily stepped forward. There really was a map? Thomas lifted his eyes. Yes. The answer was simple, direct, undeniable. The room became perfectly still. Caldwell swallowed. Where is it? Thomas did not answer immediately. Instead, his gaze drifted toward the battlefield display beneath the glass, toward the tiny creek, the ridge, the valley, the forgotten trail that should not have existed. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 70 years. I have not seen it since 1953. Several historians exchanged stunned looks. One researcher immediately opened a laptop and began searching archive databases. Another started taking notes so quickly that his pen nearly slipped from the page. The old veteran watched them quietly. After the battle, he continued, a corrected field sketch was drawn. Caldwell listened carefully. Every word now mattered. It showed the actual positions. The trail. The route through the wash. Everything. Emily frowned. Then why was it never used? Thomas gave a faint, sad smile. Because somebody filed the wrong version first. The answer was almost absurd in its simplicity. Yet everyone in the room understood exactly how such a thing could happen. Records were created by people. And people made mistakes. Sometimes small mistakes survived for generations. The retired colonel slowly closed his notebook. There were rumors for years, he admitted. Most historians dismissed them. Caldwell looked up sharply. Rumors about what? The colonel hesitated. Then he answered. That one surviving witness kept the only clue to finding the corrected map. Every eye turned toward Thomas Whitaker. The old veteran lowered his gaze to the compass once more. Then, very carefully, he pressed a fingernail against a nearly invisible seam running along its edge. A soft click echoed through the silent hall. And suddenly everyone realized the compass was not just a keepsake. The click was barely audible, yet it seemed louder than anything else in the room. Every conversation stopped. Every movement froze. Thomas Whitaker carefully turned the old compass in his hand and pressed against the hidden seam once more. The metal casing separated slightly, revealing a compartment so small that most people would never have noticed it existed. Emily Carter took an involuntary step forward. Dr. Evan Caldwell simply stared. For years he had studied battlefield artifacts. He had cataloged thousands of objects. Yet he had never seen anything quite like this. Thomas slowly opened the compartment. Inside was a tightly folded piece of paper no larger than a postage stamp. The paper had yellowed with age. Its edges were worn and fragile. The museum hall fell completely silent. Nobody wanted to breathe too hard. My God, one historian whispered. Thomas looked at the folded paper for several seconds before touching it. His expression was impossible to read. It was not excitement. It was not triumph. It looked more like the weight of a promise carried for far too long. Carefully, he removed the tiny paper and placed it on the glass display case. Caldwell immediately reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of archival gloves. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the fragile document. The room leaned closer. The paper contained only a few lines. A name, a date, a storage reference number, and a location. Caldwell blinked twice. Then read it again. This cannot be real. Emily looked over his shoulder. Her eyes widened instantly. The location was not a military archive. It was not a government records facility. It was a courthouse storage annex nearly 300 miles away. A building nobody in the room had ever associated with battlefield history. Why would it be there? One researcher asked. Thomas gave a tired smile. Because nobody would think to look there. The answer seemed almost absurd. Yet it made perfect sense. Hidden records survived because people stopped searching in unexpected places. The retired colonel folded his arms. That would explain why nobody ever found it. Caldwell was already pulling out his phone. His academic instincts had fully taken over. The public presentation no longer mattered. The exhibit no longer mattered. There was only one question left. Was the corrected map still there? Calls began immediately. Museum administrators contacted county officials. Archive specialists were pulled into conference lines. Researchers opened databases. The atmosphere transformed into controlled chaos. Hours passed. Evening became night. Yet nobody left. Emily watched Thomas sitting quietly on a bench near the display. While everyone else rushed to solve the mystery, he remained perfectly calm, almost detached, as if he already knew how the story would end. Near midnight, a museum employee hurried into the hall carrying a tablet. His face had gone pale. They found something, he said. The room instantly fell silent. Caldwell took the tablet. A scanned image appeared on the screen. Old paper, military markings, handwritten corrections, a field sketch, the corrected field sketch. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Caldwell slowly lifted his eyes toward Thomas Whitaker. The historian who had once challenged him now looked genuinely humbled. You were right, he said quietly. But Thomas was not looking at the screen. His gaze rested on a single handwritten note near the bottom of the recovered map. A note nobody else in the room had noticed yet. The room gathered around the recovered field sketch as if it were a living thing. Midnight had long passed. The museum lights had been dimmed everywhere except around the battlefield display and the cluster of historians standing shoulder to shoulder around the screen. Nobody cared about the hour anymore. They cared about the truth. Dr. Evan Caldwell enlarged the image again. Every correction Thomas Whitaker had described was there. The hidden trail, the actual route through the wash, the revised positions. Decades of accepted history had been built upon an earlier version that contained critical mistakes. Yet none of that was what held Thomas's attention. His eyes remained fixed on the handwritten note near the bottom corner of the recovered sketch. Emily Carter noticed it first. "What does it say?" she asked softly. Caldwell adjusted the image. The handwriting was faded but still legible. Slowly, he read the words aloud. Corrected using witness testimony from Daniel Miller and Thomas Whitaker. Preserve both accounts. Future historians will need them. Silence followed. Not the silence of confusion. The silence of realization. The note had been written by someone who knew exactly how easily memories could disappear. Someone who understood that official records alone were not enough. Thomas stared at the screen. His pale blue eyes reflected the faint glow of the monitor. "That was Captain Reynolds," he said quietly. "He promised us he would fix the record." Emily looked at him. "And he did." Thomas nodded once. Eventually, a few people laughed softly. The tension that had filled the museum all day finally began to fade. Caldwell lowered the tablet. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he turned toward the old veteran, the same man he had politely dismissed only hours earlier. "I owe you an apology." Thomas looked genuinely surprised. "For what?" "For assuming the documents knew more than the people who lived them." The old veteran smiled faintly. Not a victorious smile, just a tired one. "That happens more often than you think." Around them, researchers continued studying the recovered sketch. Plans were already being discussed. The exhibit would be corrected. New annotations would be added. The story of Miller's cut would finally be included. The forgotten trail would no longer be forgotten. Neither would Daniel Miller. The retired colonel closed his notebook and slipped it back into his pocket. 70 years, he murmured. And all it took was one man walking into a museum. Emily glanced toward Thomas. He was carefully placing the old compass back into his jacket pocket. The hidden compartment was closed once again. Its job was finished. "What will you do now?" she asked. Thomas looked around the hall one last time. At the display. At the historians. At the corrected map that had finally found its way home. "Go home," he said. "I only came here because something felt wrong." Caldwell extended his hand. Thomas shook it. No speeches followed. No cameras flashed. No grand ceremony was announced. Somehow that made the moment more powerful. As Thomas slowly walked toward the exit, the entire room watched him go. Not because he was famous, not because he wanted recognition, but because every person there now understood something they had forgotten. History is made of documents, but truth often survives inside people. And sometimes the quietest witness carries the piece everyone else is missing. Some men do not correct history for recognition. They do it for the names history forgot.